The aroma of premium Colombian coffee filled the boardroom on the floor of Manhattan's financial district. Keisha Williams balanced the Italian porcelain tray with the precision of someone who had turned invisibility into art. Her footsteps were whispers against the marble as the executives discussed figures that she mentally converted into 3 different languages: English, French, and Haitian Creole. But no one knew that. The European market demands linguistic sophistication, declared CEO Jonathan Matthews, adjusting the cuff of his Hermes shirt. His voice carried the arrogance of someone born speaking 2 languages, privilege and wealth. Keisha poured her coffee. Her fingers brushed the handle of the cup for a split second. Matthews didn't even look at her. "We need someone who really understands French refinement," he continued, completely ignoring the presence of the woman who had just facilitated his morning comfort. For 3 years, Keisha had watched these men's linguistic limitations masquerade as executive competence. They stumbled through basic French during international video conferences, but they never admitted their failures. She knew every accent, every cultural nuance, every grammatical error they made without realizing it. Her degree in linguistics from Columbia University was tucked away in a drawer, along with proficiency certificates no one ever asked to see. The diploma didn't change the color of her skin, and the color of her skin didn't change her expectations of her. "Keisha, more coffee, please," the CEO ordered without looking up from his tablet. As always, she was a verb: serving, cleaning, organizing, never a noun capable of contributing. She refilled their cups, listening to them plan next week's meeting with the French investor. Their linguistic concerns were almost comical for someone who had dreamed of speaking French since she was 8, but her knowledge was not welcome in that space. Yet, as she collected the empty cups, Keisha wondered how many other women like her served coffee in rooms where they might be leading meetings. The door to the room closed behind her with a soft click. Outside, Keisha took a deep breath and checked the calendar on her phone. Meeting with French investor, next Monday, 2 p.m., Monday, 1:45 p.m. The private elevator opened its gilded doors to reveal Pierre-Antoine Dubois, a Parisian investor whose surname carried more history than some countries. His hand-cut Brioni suit whispered power in every line. Keisha was organizing the presentation documents when she heard him greet the receptionist in flawless English, but with that French accent that made American executives instinctively bow. Money spoke all languages, especially the language of submission. In the boardroom, Matthews tried to impress with French phrases that sounded like crunching glass. Keisha served Evian mineral water, and the French irony wasn't lost on her as she watched the CEO make mistakes that would make a first-year French student cower in shame. Dubois maintained a polite smile, the kind of smile rich people use to hide their contempt, but his eyes revealed everything. He was evaluating more than numbers. He was measuring competence, sophistication, cultural credibility, and Matthews was failing miserably. "Sir Matthews," Dubois interrupted gently, "perhaps we could continue in English? Your French is charming, but we need clarity on business." A blush crept up Matthews' neck like volcanic lava. Around the table, the other executives lowered their eyes, pretending to study reports they had already memorized. The humiliation was palpable and collective. Keisha stood in the corner, refilling glasses of water that no one drank, watching men who made millions be exposed for their most basic limitations. How did they get so high knowing so little? Dubois began to speak about the nuances of the European market and the importance of cultural sophistication. His words flowed like liquid silk, each syllable a demonstration of refinement these Americans would never possess. Matthews nodded as if he understood, but Keisha saw his hands tremble slightly as he reached for the glass of water. The CEO scribbled meaningless notes. The marketing director surreptitiously checked his cell phone. The vice president nervously adjusted his tie. None of them understood a single technical word Dubois pronounced in French. The cruel irony of privilege. Keisha understood everything, every financial concept, every cultural reference, every linguistic subtlety that transformed that negotiation into a symphony for which she was the only truly fluent audience. They were born with silver spoons but never learned to speak the language of sophistication they pretended to possess. She was born in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, but she spoke languages that they paid translators to whisper in her ears. The French investor looked around the room, clearly disappointed with the intellectual level of his potential American partners. His eyes landed briefly on Keisha. For a split second, she felt him via Really a via. Dubois closed his Italian leather briefcase and sighed delicately. Gentlemen, perhaps we need a more sophisticated for this partnership. Matthews swallowed hard. The $50 million contract was slipping through his incompetent fingers. How many opportunities are lost because the proud refuse to admit their limitations? Keisha closed her eyes for a second and heard the voice of Grandma Claudette echoing in Haiti's musical French. Darling, language is the most powerful weapon you have. At 7, she translated government letters for her grandmother, who had raised 5 children alone in Port-au-Prince before crossing oceans in search of dignity. Claudette cleaned offices on Wall Street during the wee hours, but spoke French with an elegance that would have made the Sorbonne bow. She had inherited not just a language, but an ancestral resistance encoded in every conjugated verb. At university, Keisha had learned a brutal lesson. Knowledge without a diploma is suspect. When he mentioned his fluency in French, the inevitable questions came. Where did you learn? Did you study in France? Are your parents academics? Every question was a disguised investigation, as if linguistic fluency were the private property of those who could afford European exchanges and bilingual schools in Connecticut. She had learned to lie by omission, to hide the truth about French-speaking kitchens between double shifts. Gradually, Keisha developed a castrated professional personality. He spoke only when necessary. He smiled when appropriate. He kept his opinions hidden like jewels too precious to be exposed. Because an intelligent black woman was disturbing, and a black woman, very intelligent, terrified. She had watched colleagues being labeled as aggressive for correcting grammatical errors. He had seen others marginalized for demonstrating knowledge that their white supervisors did not possess. Black competence was always suspected of being arrogance. In that moment, watching Dubois speak in fluent French while Matthews pretended to understand, Keisha felt the familiar weight of self-betrayal. For how many years had she chosen the safety of silence over the honesty of her ability? But the system had been clear. Black knowledge needed to come with certificates, diplomas from prestigious institutions, professors with French surnames, trips abroad financed by family trust funds. His French had a Haitian accent, which was considered inferior to the French he learned at Middlebury College. Keisha remembered Claudette telling stories about Haiti, about how French had been a colonial imposition but also a tool of resistance, how Haitian revolutionaries had used the language of the oppressor to codify revolts and proclaim independence. They can't take away what they can't give you, Grandma whispered. Her knowledge hadn't come from privilege. It had come from necessity, from survival, from familial love passed down in nighttime conversations. That didn't make him lesser. It made him revolutionary. In the conference room, Dubois continued to expose the linguistic limitations of these powerful men. Keisha could save them. She could facilitate communication. She could be the bridge between worlds. But why should she protect their incompetence when they never protected her competence? Would it be fair to use her knowledge to save those who kept her invisible? Or had the time come to let them face the consequences of their own mediocrity? Matthews stumbled over his words like a lost tourist in Montmartre. His hands trembled imperceptibly as he leafed through papers, searching for salvation that didn't exist on paper. Sweat appeared first on his forehead, then on his temples. Dubois waited with the cruel patience of someone watching a shipwreck in slow motion. Keisha could feel the tension thickening the air like molasses. Every second of silence weighed heavily in the room where millionaire egos were being crushed by the reality of their own limitations. Matthews made his third attempt. He stopped abruptly, realizing he had just cursed in French during a $50 million negotiation. The CEO cleared his throat nervously. The marketing director studied his nails intently. The VP of operations adjusted his tie for the 5th time in 2 minutes. Like a synchronized choreography of shame, all eyes turned to Keisha, not asking, demanding, as if she were a tool forgotten in the corner of the garage, finally needed to fix what was broken. Keisha felt the moment crystallize around her. 17 years of intellectual invisibility converged in those looks that mixed desperation and expectation. They needed her, but they didn't want her. Admit who needed her. The silence lasted 3 seconds. It seemed like 3 centuries. Dubois watched the dynamics with growing interest, like an anthropologist studying primitive tribal behavior. His intelligent eyes immediately grasped what was happening. Their salvation was black-skinned and had been conveniently ignored until that moment. Matthews took a deep breath, the red of humiliation rising up his neck like a boiling thermometer. He couldn't ask for help directly. That would be admitting that a black secretary knew more than a Harvard-educated CEO. But he could expect her to save his dignity without him having to publicly acknowledge his incompetence. Keisha felt every fiber of her being vibrate in that instant. It was the moment. The point of no return where she could choose between the safety of invisibility or the courage of manifestation. Grandmother Claudette whispered in her memory, "When you know, how can you keep silent?" She could continue being the useful tool in the corner of the room. She could keep her job, her security, her protective anonymity that had kept her employed for 3 years. Or he could do what they would never expect, exist intellectually. Keisha looked at Dubois, who was waiting with genuine interest. He looked at Matthews, whose career depended on the next few minutes. He looked at the other executives, all suspended between wounded pride and desperate need. They wanted her to save them by remaining invisible. But what if she saved them by taking the center of the table? Dubois leaned forward slightly, clearly bored by the spectacle of incompetence. His voice cut through the thick air of the room like a sharp blade. "Excuse me, but does anyone here actually understand the fiscal implications of this European structure?" The question hung in the air like toxic smoke. Matthews opened his mouth, closed it. His lips moved like a fish out of water, searching for words in a language he had never truly mastered. And then it happened. Absolutely. "The tax structure you propose would create a 15% optimization of our European revenues, but we would have to restructure our Irish subsidiaries to avoid the implications of the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive." The voice was clear, precise, fluent. It was Keisha's voice. The silence that followed was unlike any other. It wasn't the silence of incompetence or shame. It was the silence of pure shock, as if the world had spun backwards for 3 seconds. Matthews turned so quickly his chair creaked like an old door. The CEO dropped his Mont Blanc pen on the marble floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence. The marketing director stopped breathing. Dubois, for the first time in the meeting, smiled genuinely. Keisha felt every pair of eyes in the room focused on her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. It was like being in the spotlight for the first time after years in the shadows. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In impeccable French, Dubois replied, "Very impressive. What about harmonization with British regulations post-Brexit?" Keisha didn't hesitate. "It will be necessary to establish a separate entity in London, but this could reduce our exposure to currency fluctuations by 12%. Matthews watched the conversation like a tennis spectator, his head swiveling from side to side, completely lost. The other executives seemed to be watching a movie subtitled in a language they couldn't identify. Dubois leaned forward even further, his eyes shining with genuine interest. "And you have a background in international finance, in linguistics and international relations, but I've always had a particular interest in European tax structuring." The truth coming out like rain after the drought. For 3 years, she had guarded this skill like buried treasure. For 3 years, she had pretended not to understand conversations she mastered better than anyone else in the room. And now, in less than 2 minutes, she had demonstrated that she knew more about European finance than executives earning 20 times her salary. Keisha could feel something fundamental shifting in the air in the room. This wasn't just a translation. This wasn't just a demonstration of linguistic fluency. It was the first time in 3 years that she had existed intellectually in that space. Dubois looked around the table, then back at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and genuine curiosity. What happens when a black woman stops pretending to be smaller than she really is? Reality hit Keisha like a cold wave crashing onto a deserted beach. Her hands began to tremble imperceptibly as the weight of her action materialized in the room. For 3 years, she had carefully cultivated a persona of an efficient but intellectually inoffensive secretary. Now, in less than 5 minutes, she had shattered that construct with the precision of a hammer against glass. There was no way to pretend it didn't happen. Keisha felt each stare like a physical weight on her shoulders. The air conditioning seemed to have stopped working. Her shirt clung slightly to her back as adrenaline surged through her body like uncontrolled electricity. Matthews stared at her with an indecipherably complex expression, part admiration, part confusion, part something that might have been fear. Afraid of what? That she knew better? That she had always known better? That for 3 years he had completely ignored the intelligence of someone who could have revolutionized his international negotiations? The CEO whispered something inaudible to the marketing director. The cruel mathematics of consequences. Keisha knew the unwritten rules of corporate America. Competent black woman was tolerable. Black woman more competent than white men in senior positions was problematic. Black woman who publicly revealed that she was more competent was revolutionary or professional suicide. Her mind was rapidly calculating the possible consequences. Would she be promoted or fired? Recognized or sabotaged? Integrated into the executive team? Or mysteriously dismissed during the next restructuring? History was full of black women who paid dearly for daring to shine brighter than expected. Dubois continued to look at her with genuine interest. But Keisha knew he was French. Europeans had different racial dynamics. Complex and problematic too, but different from Americans. He saw competence. They saw a threat. The difference was cultural and dangerous. Dubois could admire her intelligence without feeling his power diminished. Matthews and the others. His white masculinity had been publicly questioned by a black subordinate. Keisha took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling in her hands. Part of her wanted to apologize, to go back to her corner, to pretend it was a momentary impulse, a coincidence, anything that would restore the comfortable status quo. But Grandmère Claudette hadn't crossed oceans for her to apologize for being brilliant. The other part, the part that had been silenced for so long, whispered something revolutionary. What if she didn't back down? What if she continued to occupy the space her competence had created? The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Every second that passed without her apologizing or slowing down was a clearer statement that she intended to remain silent. Vista. Matthews cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Keisha could feel the entire room awaiting her next move. Would she return to her corner? Would she continue translating anonymously? Or would she do something even more audacious? Dubois leaned back in his Italian leather chair, a genuine smile spreading across his face like dawn breaking the darkness. It wasn't the polite smile he'd offered Matthews. It was pure recognition, the kind that only happens when intelligence meets intelligence. "Mademoiselle," he said, deliberately switching to English so everyone would understand. "Can you continue?" 4 words that echoed through the room like a cathedral bell. Keisha felt the world stop for a moment. He wasn't asking her to translate discreetly from the corner. He was officially inviting her into the conversation, to the table. Matthews swallowed, the sound audible in the heavy silence. His hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles turning white against the dark wood. Dubois had just done something unthinkable in corporate America. He had transferred authority from a white CEO to a black secretary. In public, deliberately. The CEO adjusted his glasses nervously. The marketing director checked his phone for the 10th time in 5 minutes. The vice president leaned back in his chair as if trying to physically distance himself from the moment. They knew they were witnessing something historic, and they didn't like it. "Sir Dubois," she said, her voice gaining a new firmness. "I believe there are some nuances in the European structure that may not be clear to everyone here." She didn't ask permission. She didn't apologize for knowing. She simply took over the space her expertise had created. Dubois nodded approvingly. "Exactly. Perhaps you could explain the technical details." Keisha stood up, physically stood up. She was no longer the invisible woman in the corner serving coffee. She was an international consultant demonstrating expertise. "The framework you are considering," she began, addressing not just Dubois but the entire room, "needs to take into account the 2023 regulatory changes in the European Union." Matthews tried to interrupt. "Keisha, maybe it would be best if—" Dubois cut in firmly. "Let her speak." Authority had officially changed hands. Keisha continued her explanation, switching fluently between English and French, demonstrating not only linguistic fluency but technical mastery that made it clear she understood the financial implications better than anyone in the room. The executives listened in forced silence, their expressions varying between grudging admiration and visceral discomfort. When he finished his analysis, precise, detailed, irrefutable, Dubois clapped his hands slowly. 3 claps that echoed like gunshots in the silent room. "Gorgeous. This is exactly the expertise we were looking for." He looked directly at Matthews. "I hope you recognize the exceptional talent you have on your team." Keisha stood tall, occupying the center of the room, radiating a presence that could never be ignored again. Dubois gestured to the empty chair beside him. It wasn't a casual invitation. It was a complete reconfiguration of the room's hierarchy. Keisha walked around the table, her footsteps echoing with an authority she'd never known she possessed. For the first time in 3 years, she sat at the conference table, not in the corner, not serving, participating. The leather of the chair was soft and expensive against her back. She could feel the symbolic weight of that moment. How many women like her had dreamed of this prospect? How many had never had the chance? For the next 2 hours, Keisha didn't just translate. She orchestrated. She explained cultural nuances that saved 3 potential misunderstandings. She suggested tax structures that would increase profitability by 22%. She identified regulations that Matthews's expensive lawyers had missed. Her mind danced between languages and concepts like a virtuoso pianist mastering complex scales. "Mademoiselle Williams," Dubois said when proposing a particularly technical clause, "what is your opinion on the viability of this?" He was asking her opinion. To her, directly. Matthews remained silent, watching his secretary transform into the international expert he never knew he had on his team. When Dubois finally opened his Montblanc pen to sign the 50 million contract, he paused. He looked around the table and said, "This deal would not have been possible without Mademoiselle Williams's exceptional expertise." Matthews forced a smile. The CEO nodded reluctantly, but Keisha could see it in everyone's eyes. They knew she had saved not only the deal, but their careers. Without it, they would have lost 50 million due to pride and linguistic incompetence. As she signed the final documents, Keisha thought of all the black women she knew. Brilliant doctors mistaken for nurses, expert lawyers treated like assistants, brilliant engineers invisible in technical meetings. Each signature on that document was also for them. For Claudette, who cleaned offices where she could have been a consultant. For all the ancestors who carried knowledge in forced silence. When the meeting ended, Dubois stood and extended his hand to Keisha. Not a polite handshake, a professional acknowledgement between equals. "Mademoiselle," he said in English for all to hear, "I look forward to working with you directly on the next phases of this project. Your company is lucky to have you." Keisha squeezed his hand tightly and replied, "I'm lucky to finally be able to contribute fully." The word echoed through the room like a silent manifesto. She had waited 3 years to fully utilize her talents. She would wait no longer. As Dubois left the room, he whispered to Keisha, "There's a director of international operations position in our New York office. Interested? Black competence, when finally recognized, doesn't just open doors. It rebuilds entire buildings. How many other Keishas are serving coffee in rooms where they could be running empires?" The marble mural in the main lobby of the Matthews and Associates had been given a new photograph. Among images of historic handshakes and billion-dollar contract signings, one photo caught my attention. Keisha Williams, now Director of International Relations, smiling alongside Dubois at the European expansion ceremony, finally at the center of the corporate narrative, where it always belonged, no longer in the corners of history, no longer as a footnote in the biographies of great businessmen, as a protagonist of the quiet revolution itself. Marcus, the young black Yale intern, stopped in front of the mural on his first day, his eyes fixed on Keisha's photo, then scanned all the other images, decades of white faces in positions of power. A single photo had changed the visual geography of success in that building. "She started out as a secretary," whispered Aaliyah, the new financial analyst, pointing to the photo. "Now she negotiates contracts worth hundreds of millions in Europe." Keisha's story had become a legend whispered in the hallways, living proof that black competence could not be silenced forever. On the 23rd floor, Maria Gonzalez, the administrative assistant fluent in Mandarin and Portuguese, raised her hand for the first time in a meeting about Asian expansion. Her voice initially trembled, but she continued, "I have some observations about the cultural nuances of the Chinese market." On the 30th floor, James Brown, an MIT-trained accountant, stopped pretending not to understand when executives made basic errors in financial analysis. On the 10th floor, Priya Patel stopped hiding her PhD in international economics from Cambridge. One black woman's courage had given others permission to stop putting themselves down. Keisha now led a team of 12 people, half of them women and people of color whom she had personally identified and promoted. Her first decision as director was to implement salary reviews based on demonstrated competency, not degrees or sorority connections. 7 black and Latino employees received 40% raises. 3 women were promoted to supervisory positions. 2 employees who were fluent in Asian languages became experts in emerging markets. In the drawer of her desk, now a mahogany executive desk, Keisha kept a letter she had written to herself the day after the historic meeting. To all the black girls who come after, you don't have to ask permission to be brilliant. You don't have to apologize for knowing more. You don't have to wait for recognition for your competence. Create your own recognition. Take up your own space. Be your own revolution. Grandmother Claudette, now 86, visited the office one Thursday afternoon. She looked around Keisha's panoramic office, then at the Manhattan view, and whispered in Creole, "My dear, you did what I could never do. You built a bridge for those who will come." The former Wall Street cleaning lady now visited her granddaughter as a Wall Street executive. The circle didn't just close, it expanded exponentially. As Keisha watched the hustle and bustle of Manhattan through her executive window, she thought of all the boardrooms around the world where black women served coffee while possessing the knowledge to run empires. If one Keisha can transform an entire company, how many others are ready to start their own quiet revolutions right now? How many Keishas do you know? How many brilliant black women are being overlooked in your workplace, in your school, in your community? Tell us in the comments. Have you ever experienced a similar situation? Do you know anyone who deserves more professional recognition? What was the moment you decided to stop putting yourself down? If you've made it this far, leave that like shows that stories of black protagonism matter. Share with someone who needs to hear that competence does not ask for permission. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell for more narratives that break stereotypes.